Ron, alcoholic. My sobriety date is December 28th, 1985, which if you're paying attention to your nearby calendar, that means that next Monday I'll be celebrating 35 years, which is really quite remarkable. You'll hear a little bit about that. But what I want to, so I do a lot of this kind of work, but what I want to start with is I just want to be brutally honest. I don't come to any of this out of virtue. I don't come to it out of some sense of professional expertise. What happened is multiple times in my recovery, despite lots of step work, lots of good solid AA, some Al-Anon thrown in, some OA thrown in. Yeah, I'm one of those people who's like in a whole bunch of programs or need to be. I got cornered over and over again by reality. And what it forced me to do was to work much more deeply with the steps than I ever imagined I would. And at some point in time, somebody, I don't remember who, said, Ron, you need to write a book. And so there's a book, there's a website. I'll provide you some information on the back end. But what I want to do is be really honest that I come to this out of hardship and difficulty. And I share that because so many of us get into recovery and, we do the deal and we get stuck and we think something's wrong with us. And actually, one of my longest mentors in recovery told me that a good program should always bring you up against the next layer of your resistance. That's what it's designed to do. It's not failure, it's success. But you're going to have to do something more, was what I was taught and told. So that's my starting point. And I'm drawing freely from an article by Bill Wilson called The Next Frontier, where he coined the phrase emotional sobriety. And what he said about emotional sobriety, in short, was that when we finally let go of our crippling dependencies on other people, on circumstances, on life, even AA, he said, which sounds like heresy, even his faulty dependencies on AA had to go because they set him up for disappointments, discouragement, ultimately a lot of depression, for those of you who know Bill's story. So I'm sourcing out of that. I'm also going to source a little bit out of my book, Progressive Recovery Through the 12 Steps, Emotionally Sober for Life. More about that on the back end. Enough about that. I do hope that you have a journal handy. One of the great secrets of recovery is when you write stuff down, it gets in. So hopefully you've got a journal handy or a piece of paper and a pen, because I certainly encourage you to jot notes just because it helps so very much. So here's our starting point. Every disappointment, every frustration, every resentment offers us an opportunity to find an expectation within ourselves that is causing the problem. I know lots of us immediately think, well, no, my problem is actually them, it, the circumstances. That is not what this emotional sobriety work in the 12 steps point us to. What it points us to is that somewhere deep down inside us, there's a blockage in us that prevents us from being able to really find the kind of peace and harmony that the steps promise. Although lots of us come in and out of it. I don't want to refute that. So if you got something to write with, before you start writing, or maybe right now, I want you to just give a thought about a disappointment, a frustration, an expectation, something that is troubling you today. Because if we're all honest, there's always something, right? And I do that because it's a workshop, and because if we're working with your material, it's going to be far more fruitful than me just talking for an hour. I expect I'll talk pretty well, but I'd like you to get a lot out of this. So if you'll write it down, and if you would like to, and this is not a requirement, I would love to have some of you drop into the chat box your frustrations, disappointments, expectations. If your partner is the source of it and they're on this thing, don't do it. Put something else in there. If it's something you can't disclose entirely, that's fine. Just give us a summary statement. But type into the chat box the things that you're up against, the things that are discouraging you right now. And the reason for doing this is partly I want to see what you all are working with. And partly I want to know how to adapt the content for the things that you may be struggling with. So the chat box, you can open by clicking on the bottom of the screen, and it'll pop this little box up on the right. And you can feel free to type anything in there that you feel comfortable typing. And again, if you don't want to, that is fine. But I think you all know that there is incredible power in admitting that something is bothering us. Aging parents. It's a tough one in this particular environment. Decisions from adult children, chronic illness, something that all of us get to deal with along the way, apparently. COVID-19, yeah, that's for those of you who weren't here, that comment comes from someone who's got COVID-19 right now. Enabling others, mom, of course, having to need a new vehicle due to an accident. Accident will mess your plans up. A grown daughter, that everything in her life is my fault. That's a painful one. I have some familiarity with that. Excessive wet weather on the ranch, adult children not facing addiction and struggling with work and finance. Okay, this is all good. And it's all the kind of stuff, recurring feeling of being in trouble. That's a good one. Eating too much during the COVID time. I sympathize with that one too. Embarrassment of phone calling, unhealthy attachments, the holiday blues. Yeah. So this is all true. And what I'd like to propose for a starter is that somewhere in all of those is an expectation that you are carrying that you probably don't know you are carrying. There's a few other items dropping in here: sisters not being able to let go, letting go of the responsibility of others' feelings, missing lost ones. Yeah. Okay. So that's a starting point. Let me start with the truth that was told to me some years ago when I first came face to face with expectations inventory, which is where we're headed. This came from a longtime sponsor by the name of Sam, who said at one point, "Ron, life is disruptive. What is your problem with that?" To which I said in my head a few choice words, because that is not what I wanted to talk about. But then he began to poke and prod and take me into this. And he insisted that every one of these disappointments had within it the seeds of something remarkable, but I was going to have to engage it. Or if you happen to like the Buddhist language from Pema Chodron, another one of the teachers I followed at different points, you have to lean into it. So he taught me to start leaning into it. And the way this all started for me almost 35 years ago, excuse me, was when my first wife left me. I was blindsided. I was distraught. I was suicidal. My most painful memory was walking down a 4-lane highway in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, drinking a beer and thinking that maybe if I got hit by a car, somehow or another, she would be sorry and that would make it all right. For me, that was a normal internal conversation. I had just never had the difficulties that I was facing that day because I thought my life was fine. Well, I went looking for a relationship therapist and somehow or another ended up in the care of an alcoholism recovery therapist, which, y'all can probably figure that one out, right? I don't know how that happens, but that's where it all began. And then just to keep it real, at about 4 years sober, when I was told that smoking tobacco would kill me by the age of 45, that was a brutally difficult moment of reckoning. I still remember taking a good hard look at myself and thinking, I'm not able to act in my own best interests. I'm killing myself. And it threw me into another set of expectations, in this case, about myself. At 12 years sober, I suddenly realized that my second marriage was not going the way I had planned. For those of you who've been in recovery for a while, some of you know this story. We don't just get sober, get married, and live happily ever after. That's actually not as common as we might like to think it is. And that threw me into the steps in a way I'd never worked in before, because I was finally willing to go somewhere. And then, much to my surprise, at 17 years sober, with another failed relationship, I realized that it was time for inpatient treatment for love addiction and codependency, which I had known about for 10 years, but had been unwilling to do the work. And so at 17 years, I checked myself in to a place in Arizona, and they did some deep, intensive work on me. And once again, we found out all kinds of expectations that were there. Now, I share all of those because way too often the stories I hear is, well, 45 minutes of drunk-a-log and then I get sober and everything's wonderful. Well, that is not my experience. I mean, there have routinely been things in recovery that have come over and over again. So the part that was really helpful, though, when Sam, who I sometimes call Master Sam Wise, when Sam said to me, Ron, they've been lying to you. And I said, who's been lying to me? He said, well, you're not the problem. You are not the problem. That is a judgmental, self-based perspective. The problem is certainly fully within you, but you are not the problem. That is a shame-based, guilt-based, self-punishing strategy. And ultimately, it'll get you loaded. So let's just let go of the idea that there's something wrong with you. That was a huge step forward, leading to this idea of expectations inventory. And I'm just gonna say a word about that. This was not really the focus of this session, but it's really important to understand. I mean, I came into recovery feeling pretty crappy about myself. So when people started saying, well, obviously you should feel crappy about yourself because you're a crappy person, I latched onto it. Well, that is such a self-destructive path. And it took me a long time to get out from under it. But Sam would not let me off the hook on the fact that the problem was fully within me, even if I wasn't the problem. And that's where he took us into the inventory. So I want to talk just for a moment about the inventory, the 4-step inventory, because there's some things that he taught me that changed it for me and hopefully will change it for you. There's a line in the big book, for those of you who are really familiar with the big book, that says the purpose of the 4th step is to discover what blocks us off from power. There's power. I'm not it. I'm blocked off. Inventory the ways we're blocked. It's actually not an inventory of what a bad human being I am. We're looking for the blockages to power within us. You can even look that up. Then I found a letter by Bill Wilson. He wrote in 1957, just about the same time he was writing about emotional sobriety. And he said this: the purpose of the moral inventory is to discover how we were damaged by life. The purpose of the moral inventory is to discover how we were damaged by life. That's a game changer for me. So what we're being told is these steps aren't there to identify what a crappy human being I am. I certainly behave crappy. I have lots of material to work with. But the point is, we're looking for what blocks us off from power. There's a great line in We Agnostics that somewhere deep down inside every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. Or again, if you want to go Buddhist, it's basic goodness. Or if you like the Course in Miracles talks about the miracle of atonement, at one-ment, the moment where suddenly you realize that all is well, all is well, all is well. So across all these themes, there's this idea that we're just looking to get the blockage removed, not to find fault with ourselves. So the part that was the follow-up on that, and what I learned when I went in for inpatient treatment at 17 years. By the way, I keep saying that because lots of us think we're not going to have to do that. And some of us absolutely are going to need some advanced work on ourselves. But what I began to learn as I began to dig into this idea that we're blocked off is that a lot of that stuff has been lifelong. The reason I was in treatment at 17 years sober, despite being off alcohol, off drugs, off tobacco, at that point I was abstinent from food. The reason I was in there was because there was an imprint that we might call codependency that was there long before I found alcohol or tobacco or any of the other substances. Actually, the correct language would be love addiction, and it came out of childhood trauma, which is actually true for an awful lot of us. So it turns out that some of the work I have to do goes all the way back to childhood. Looking for causes and conditions, the big book says, the things that set us up. So that's kind of the foundation we're resting upon, that the purpose of this is to find out where we're blocked off from power, I'm going to propose to you that oftentimes it's expectations, which is where we're getting ready to go right now. Some of these date back to childhood. Actually, lots of them date back to childhood. Many of us don't want to go there. In fact, we've been told quite often, I'm not a drunk because my mama treated me badly. Well, that's actually not the whole story. The whole story, as I understand it, is my mom and my dad and my people gave me the very best they had, and it was terribly insufficient. And I ended up damaged by life as a result of that. And recovery has been about getting undamaged by life, about being restored to sanity. The second step, restoration to sanity, is a progressive statement. The degree of sanity that I have today can be greater tomorrow if I will work more deeply with these steps. It's a progressive promise to get saner and saner and saner. So, with that, let's talk about expectations. Now, the tool I'm going to send you on the back end, I noticed that we've got some kind of a different screen up right now, Leslie. Looks like someone's phone screen.
I'm sorry, I don't know how.
That's okay. I just thought I would make sure and shout out that it was there.
Yes.
Well, it looks like we're viewing Marvin. We're viewing Marvin's iPhone screen.
I'll figure this out here.
Okay. Well, I'll just go ahead and keep talking.
Please do.
All right. All right. So there we go. Marvin, don't feel ashamed by that once you figure out how it is that you ended up on the screen, but somehow or another you screen shared your phone. All right. So let's talk about expectations. There are three kinds of expectations we want to look at. The first is expectations of others. The second is expectations of ourselves. And the third is expectations of the circumstances or life we find ourselves in. So it's others, ourselves, and the circumstances or life circumstances that we find ourselves in. So this is where I'm going to offer to you one of the most powerful prayers I have used with this work, because our egos don't want us to see things. It's the way they're designed. That's not a fault in your wiring. That's how an ego works. It's self-protective, even if it isn't helpful ultimately. The prayer is, higher power or progressive power or whatever you want to call that power. Apparently, it doesn't care what we think of it. Help me to see what I need to see, feel what I need to feel, and learn what I need to learn. Help me to see what I need to see, feel what I need to feel, learn what I need to learn, which has proven to be an incredibly useful prayer that apparently makes me willing, or mantra if you prefer mantras. So let's talk about expectations of others. So let me connect the dots here. So when I have a resentment, a frustration, and exasperation, all that stuff, and it is projected onto another human being, what's in the background is an expectation that I have of that human being. My favorite story about this was one day a woman called me who knew me from the recovery rooms in Greenville, South Carolina. She called me and she said, look, I got this friend. You all know this, right? I got this friend. So, okay, tell me about your friend. And she said, well, my friend's got an abusive husband. I said, okay, fair enough. And she said, well, you talk all about this expectation stuff. Isn't it realistic for her to not expect to be harmed by her husband? And I said, okay, take a deep breath now. The only expectation that is realistic is one that will be met by the other party. Is the only realistic expectation. Asking an abuser to not be abusive is a fool's game. A different question for her was, so like, what's your friend doing in this situation? I share that on the front end because what we're always looking for is a justification to hold on to something that we don't want to deal with. And so the only reasonable expectation of Leslie or me or any of you on this call is that you will be yourself. Any expectation other than that is my fool's game, and that's what I'm bringing to this party. Expecting you to be different. Maybe you will be, maybe there'll be a miracle. But I have to take a deep breath, swallow one of those large chunks of truth about myself and go, okay, this is the person on the other side of this now. Where's the problem here? And in this case, the problem was that this friend of this woman who was talking to me had an expectation that her husband should be different, had an expectation that he shouldn't hit her or emotionally abuse her, had an expectation that if she did something, maybe he would change, had an expectation that maybe if he stopped drinking, which he couldn't do, he was going to stop doing these things. Do you hear the whole pattern? It's an extreme example. I mean, the different question that had to be asked, and if you've done any work, any of you with people who've been in domestic violence situations, is, so let's go deeper on that. What's the expectation I have that keeps putting me in harm's way? That actually crosses over into the expectations I may have of myself. But our starting point is, what's the expectation I have of the other person? I was like, okay, well, let's see. I'm going to go back in my own history. I have an expectation that my dad is going to be sober on Christmas. Well, that set up a whole bunch of disappointing Christmases because that was just not my dad's story. God bless him. He was a good man, but he had an alcohol problem just like I do. Another interesting expectation is that my boss will appreciate me. I'm sorry, some bosses aren't appreciative. It's like trying to appease someone who's unappeasable. Lots of us have expectations that our kids ought to be more respectful of us. They ought to appreciate the things we have done. And if they're like 15 years old, I'm sorry, that's not in their wiring. It's like expecting a 15-year-old to think of anybody other than themselves is just a fool's game. And yet I get disappointed or hurt because my kid doesn't treat me with appropriate regard. And I'm speaking about my own personal experience here with both my daughters, where I've had to do a bunch of work about these expectations about how they ought to be different. And what Sam would always tell me, this was annoying as it could be, but it was powerful. I'd call him and I'd bitch for a while, which I'm sure none of you do that. I would call and bitch for a while, and then Sam would say, well, Ron, he actually had a Texas twang. Well, Ron, sounds to me like she's being a perfect version of herself. What is your problem with that? And then I'd complain about my wife. And go, well, sounds to me like your wife is just being true to form. That's who she is. What is your problem with that? And he did it over and over and over and over again until finally that great material in the 4-step in the big book penetrated. That section where it talks about other people being spiritually sick. And we have to turn the mirror and look at ourselves and ask a different question. So if I expect any one of you to be any different than the way you are, I have set myself up for a disappointment, a frustration, an exasperation. And if I dig deeply into that, we can find all kinds of material, perhaps that crosses a lifetime. There's a great line in the 8-step in the 12 and 12 that says, sometimes as we do this work, we will see and understand the patterns that underlie our lives in relationships, which makes sense for those of us who have, I guess I was sitting in a meeting one day and the topic was relationships and marriages. And one guy goes, well, I'm on wife number 8 and they just won't show up right. And everybody laughs like, well, there's a pattern. So our starting point is, where do we think someone else should be different? And just to really put this in the big leagues for a moment, that's called conditional behavior. It is the antithesis of unconditional love, which is something we talk a lot about. Instead, what I want to do is give you full permission to be who you are. And then I've got to ask myself a different set of questions about why I'm involved with you the way I am. Okay, so our first part of expectations inventory is, what do I expect of them that they are not fulfilling? That's on me, not them. By the way, I also, raising my hand, I'm a member of Badgers Anonymous. I used to think that the way to solve that problem was to badger the hell out of people until they changed, which basically failed utterly over and over again. All it did was harm the other person and annoy me because it didn't work. So if you're a member of Badgers Anonymous, you can send me an email and we can talk about that. It doesn't work. All right, so what about these expectations of ourselves? This is probably one of the more uncomfortable places for us because many of us do come into recovery, and many of us are long in recovery thinking that we're pretty bad actors in some way or another. My particular story on this was when I got married, and this is one of those, man, it was brutal and beautiful. I could not stop emotionally abusing my two stepdaughters. I could not stop. People would tell me, you know better. And I would go, I know better. I can't stop. I'm powerless. You're not powerless. You just need to try harder. So I'd try harder and fail. And I don't know how many amends I had to make to those two girls. It was a lot because I could not stop. My frustrations with them, which I was not resolved with, and my frustrations with their mom, who's a perfectly fine woman and human being, all came back at me because I kept thinking that I should be strong, that I should be capable, that I had this time in recovery and I should be above that kind of bad behavior. I was sharing about this one day in a meeting about how it was a Saturday meeting, and I was sharing about how I had just lost it that morning, and I had kicked the stove, put a dent in the stove, almost broke my ankle. So I shared that, and I was like, I don't know, I guess 11 or 12 years sober. And of course, a lot of people didn't want to talk about that because we know in sobriety, you're not supposed to act like that, except we do. So after the meeting, a guy named Steve came up and he said, oh, let me tell you about this SOB I chased down on the freeway just yesterday. And he was about the same amount of sober as me. And he proceeded to tell me how this thing, something just snapped. And he was sharing with me because he felt so guilty about it. Because we know that when you're 12 years sober, you're not supposed to chase someone down the freeway because you want to kill them. But that was a reality. And so what we have to begin to look at is these expectations. In some cases, in my case, they are perfectionistic. If you're familiar with the adult children's language, and I'm an adult child of alcoholism as well, the language is that we are perfectionistic personalities. And yes, I project that on others, but I most certainly hold it out upon myself. And that critic we talk about in our heads is just a brutal story that hammers away at us, thinking that if we just punish ourselves enough, we'll be better. And so somewhere along the way, I have to let go of the expectation. I'm going to tell you the trick that I learned about this, again, courtesy of Sam. Sam gave me a mantra: thank you that my best is good enough, and that this moment is my best. Thank you that my best is good enough, and thank you that this moment is my best. What that opened up for me was a realization that in every given moment, I'm bringing the best Ron I know how to bring. That doesn't mean it's adequate. That doesn't mean it's healthy. That doesn't mean it's virtuous. That doesn't mean in some cases it's even sober, at least emotionally sober. It means that in any given moment, and when you study depth psychology, you begin to find out it's like this is game-changing stuff. That at every single moment, this is the best Ron I have access to at that moment. I may be blocked off from a better version, in which case I have inventory work to do. So there's a lot of self-forgiveness practice in my progressive recovery these days, a whole lot of self-forgiveness. In fact, it makes up probably half of my inventory work. The amends I make are to let myself off the hook, because my expectations of myself are unrealistic and I fail them all the time. And then my history is to punish myself. So first, what are my expectations of others? Second, what are my expectations of myself? And then the third one is, and this was my favorite one, which I say wink, wink, is what do I expect life or relationships or situations to bring me? And the way I finally figured this one out was I was complaining yet again to Sam. He put up with a lot of complaining for a long time. And I was complaining about a work situation. And he said, Ron, I notice you're always kind of discontented. You know, that line about restless, irritable, and discontented. Well, I had cornered the market on discontent. And he said in his Texas drawl, have you ever thought that maybe you're expecting more from life than life is designed to provide? And he got my attention. By then, we'd done a bunch of this other expectations work. And I says, well, what are you like pointing at, Sam? And he said, well, hell, if you walk into a job thinking the point of that job is to fulfill you, you're screwed, buddy. If you're in a relationship because you think that other person is going to take care of your security needs, you are screwed. If you think somebody else on the other side of something is going to nurture you, I mean, maybe they will, very likely they won't, you are screwed. He was now in Bill Wilson's space, the emotional sobriety. That if my well-being is dependent on how you treat me, or if my well-being is dependent on how life treats me, if my well-being is dependent on the job lining up the way I seem to think it's supposed to, if my well-being is dependent on the weather, for God's sake, anybody here ever had a meltdown because the weather didn't cooperate? That's a fairly common one. If my well-being is dependent on life lining up in some way, shape, or fashion, I'm a train wreck in the making. There's a really, really great line in a book called The Way of Powerlessness by Wayne Lickerman. Highly recommended, but it will annoy you terribly. At least it did me. And that's really his name, Wayne Lickerman. He's long time sober. He practices a discipline called Advaita. And the line that I use so often, he says, let's be honest. We don't get what we ask for. We don't get what we need. We don't get what we want. We don't even get what we pray for. We get what we get. What are we going to do with that? Which is a lot like our motto in AA, life on life's terms. Life is going to show up the way it does. Chronic illness, aging parents, COVID, a lot of disharmony in the world, weather disruptions. And so if my expectation is that life is going to align in some way with what I think it ought to, there is a safe bet that I'm going to have disappointments, frustrations, exasperations, annoyances, resentments, etc. Yes, I can cop a resentment at the weather. I've been known to do that as well. And so the question is, what am I going to do with these expectations that don't match reality? That's the question. And it's about my expectation. That doesn't mean reality maybe shouldn't be different. That says that reality is not different. It is what it is, as they say. And so what am I going to do with that? And the answer is I'm going to have to dig deep and find out why I'm disenchanted with the way that life is. Now, I want to make sure and say this. That doesn't mean that all of this stuff is okay. It is not okay that people abuse us. It is not okay that people perpetrate children. It is not okay that we've got all this devastating language that's in our culture right now. It is not okay that, I mean, pick your political issue, there's dozens of them. But it is what it is. So the question becomes, and I'm going to go to Father Richard Rohr now. Some of you know him from the Center of Action and Contemplation. He actually wrote a really, really good book called Breathing Underwater about a layman's interpretation of the 12 steps that has been really useful to a lot of people in recovery. What Richard Rohr suggests to us is that everything is exactly right based on these time, places, and circumstances. And our job is to do the expectations work, because what's on the other side of expectations work is acceptance of the way things are, of the way people are, of the way I am. If you never follow this, you know, in the back of the big book, there's that great acceptance reading that people either love or hate. If you read that, the setup for the part that we always read is actually this guy's relationship with his wife, Max. And what he's owning is that he has stopped seeing the brilliance of Max. He has come to expect her to be different, and she's not. And it's a game changer for him that opens up that whole acceptance section. It doesn't mean that we don't work to alter things. It means that our starting point is full acceptance of the way things are, including you and me. There's a great line in The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, if you all happen to like The Power of Now, where he says that that's his actual language is, some student asked, well, am I just supposed to just like do nothing when my car's stuck in the mud? And he said, no, well, I'd love to do his accent, but Eckhart Tolle said, no, no, what I'm telling you is your starting point is to accept that you're stuck in the mud. That's your starting point. Not to kick the tires, not to yell at the car, not to yell at yourself, not to berate whoever's with you, but to start with acceptance. It's like, I am stuck in the mud. That's the only place we can start with reality. So what expectations does is it gives us a way to go into what is known as column 4 of the inventory and to find out what I'm bringing to things, people, relationships, circumstances, life itself. I want to make sure and offer some hope because this all sounds really dire. It was like, Jesus, we're screwed. Well, yeah, we are screwed. But the starting point to getting unscrewed is accepting that you're screwed because you just keep doing this stuff over and over again. You don't even know you're doing it. At least I don't, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what y'all are doing, but if you're like me, I think some of this is probably relevant to you. So here's the hope. The most amazing thing about the 12 steps and how they work is you don't actually have to find the solution. What you have to do is get clear of the nature of the impediment, the blockage within you, and the blockage gets addressed. It's the most miraculous thing in the world. I don't know whether we could say it's the force or, God or a progressive power or Abba or Tao, I don't know. But most of our time, at least with the inventory work I've done with others, is spent not looking at where we're blocked off, trying to find some way around it. And what happens when we finally realize the expectation we're bringing? When I finally saw, let me think of a particularly good example. Well, I'll go back to the discontent that I experienced so much of. God, that was hard. When I finally realized that I opened my eyes every single day thinking that life was going to cooperate with me, it changed everything. Like, oh, Ron, that's foolish. I mean, life is not going to cooperate with any of my addict's plans. Life is going to do what life does. And as soon as I was able to move into understanding that I woke every day beginning that way, I call it the addict's dream, the idea that it's supposed to be easy, a cavort through the tulip patch. When I finally realized that I was launching myself when I got up first thing in the morning every single day for discontent, because I had expectations of life that invariably were not met and invariably produced discontent. And I'd inventory the hell out of it. I'd go to bed and I would wake up the next morning and my eyes would pop open and I would do it again. Day after day after day until finally I did see it clearly enough. And it's like, okay, I'm done. This is the 7th step now. Right? The 7th step. It's like, okay, I'm screwed. I got nothing. I got nothing. I don't have a solution for this. I don't know how to fix me. Never knew how to fix me. Nothing I got will solve this problem. I don't know how to not have expectations of life. So, and here's my simple form of the 7th step prayer today. Okay, higher power, do me. Just do me. I don't know what to ask for. I don't know what the remedy looks like. Just do me, because I'm gonna cry. I got nothing. I am beyond human aid. The stuff I'm up against runs so deep in me, like the stain through marble. I don't have a clue how to have this be different. That's what I call hitting my knees in the 7th step, being brought to my knees with clarity that I don't know how to repair this stuff. But when I can see it, when I can do the expectations inventory, When I can get that stuff up, cough up the hairball, as I like to sometimes say, which sounds graphic and gory, doesn't it? Is what happens is then power begins to move. And I don't know how that works. I just know that it works. It's happened over and over and over again to me. As I've gone back and done these retrospective sober biographies, what I see is that the pattern over and over again for every breakthrough, every single one of them was, I tried to will my way into a solution. It eventually broke me, brought me to my knees, understanding what the nature of the problem really was. And in that moment, what some of us who believe in, you know, the Judeo-Christian God would call grace fell upon me. You know, and I'm going to go Buddhist for a second because I love some of the Buddhist stuff. You know, I would say suddenly my basic goodness was revealed. Not through anything that I did, it just showed up. So expectations open this up. So I'll offer this up, and then I'm going to see if there are a few questions that people would like to put in the chat box that I can try and briefly address. I talk about this as a progressive recovery because my experience is that if I can do the work, starting with expectations or any other place to look at the blockages within me, it can get completely transformed in me. And I do mean that, completely transformed in me. There are some things that have made right in me that are just, I do not know how I came from a guy who abused his daughters to someone who treats them pretty much all the time with unconditional positive regard. I do not know how that happened. I didn't do that. It happened. I'm not sure how, but I did a lot of inventory on that. I don't have any discontent anymore. It's gone. When I finally realized that I was doing it to myself with these expectations of life that I began every day and it fell away, it's like, okay, all right, so, okay. The day is the day. Let's see what we're going to do with that. In fact, my latest practice, which I haven't talked very much about, is my heaven on earth practice, which I know sounds really highfalutin. But what I'm working with is the idea, if you like scriptural material, that every day is manna from heaven. Every day, every circumstance, every moment is manna from heaven. And I really believe that today. I really do. And it's really my experience. Something has been altered in me. Even when things go awry, it's like, well, glory be. Well, that's not always true. Sometimes I have nice little cussing fits. Let's just be honest. I am not holy yet. But I'm a work in progress. But so much of the discontent has just been removed. Some of the best work I do professionally now, people tell me it's effective, which is, God, I'm so humbled by this, because they get it that I don't have any judgment for them. Take the judgment out. It's easy for people to do work with you. I don't know where that went. I don't know how that got remedied in me. I do know that I had to inventory the hell out of the expectations that produced the judgments of others. It's a remarkable thing. Stuff has been made right that I didn't know needed making right, and I certainly didn't know how to get it made right. But the answer is, if we go deeply enough in these steps and discover the blockages, expectations is a fine way to do it. The beauty of this is every disappointment is an opportunity for inventory. Every single one of them, every frustration is an opportunity. It's a sign that I have a false expectation of some kind. So like I can do 10 steps all day long. And some days I kind of try to do that and it wears me out. So it's this beautiful diagnostic system. And I'll say this about Sam, and then we'll see if some of you have some questions you would like to ask. Sam used to say quite often that you can trust life's design. Now, if you want to put that in common parlance these days, we can go Hunger Games. The odds really are ever in our favor. They really are. That's the design. but we can't find that design till we lean into it and explore why we're not experiencing that, which is the beauty of the expectations inventory. So I just dropped an item into the chat box. It's downloadable Word file. It has a little bit of the stuff from Bill Wilson's emotional sobriety work in The Next Frontier. You can just double click on it. It should download onto your device. It also has just a very, very brief amount of information about the book in which all of this is, that includes, I've summarized some of the expectations inventory in the tool. And there's a couple of other references there, including a reference to a site, progressiverecovery.org, which is a free site with lots of content that explores this kind of stuff. You don't have to do anything for it, and we don't advertise. It's one of the ways I'm paying it back or paying it forward. So download that. You can take a look at that. I'm happy to see your questions in the chat box. We have a few minutes for that. Or your disagreements with me, or your exasperations with me, or whatever the heck is going on. But I'm happy to respond to questions if someone would like to drop in the chat box. I'd offer to let you unmute yourself, but what we learned about people like us is we won't stop talking. So it's like the chat box. The chat box will keep us all in order. Yes, Sam is still alive. He lives in Texas. To be honest, he and I had a parting of the ways. That's a whole nother story I could tell you a lot about. Actually, Sam D. He lives just outside Austin. He worked with me for 28 years before we decided parting our ways was the best thing to do. Amazing thing. I thought he was just a drunk. Turned out he knew a lot about a whole bunch. Can you talk a little bit more about how you forgave yourself? How did you get there? It seems so overwhelming and insurmountable. Yeah. I use the 10th step for that. Because remember, the 10th step actually has built into it what they call the on-the-fly inventory. So if you remember the format in the big book, it's continue to watch for selfishness, blah, blah, blah. When we see it, we ask God to remove it at once. We tell another human being. We make an amend if need be, and then we resolutely turn our thoughts to someone we can help, or to come back to the now. So the way I use that now is anytime I feel the judgment voice, or hear the judgment voice, or feel myself critiquing myself unfairly, I follow that formula. Okay, higher power, take this from me. I don't want this anymore. Show me what I need to see, feel, and learn so you can do something with this. And then journaling is like telling another human being. My journal is with me pretty much all the time. So I will write it down when I have the opportunity. Generally, that act is the amend. It's an amend to and for ourselves for being punitive. And then I drop it and I try and come back to what's right in front of me. And to be really honest, when those things really get ratcheted up, I may have to do that repetitively for a while because it won't stop. I just keep asking for help because I'm desperate enough. So it's a practice I do over and over again. You can do the same thing with that repetitive 10th step with if you catch yourself having expectations of someone in your life and they just keep falling short. It's like, okay, higher power, take away my expectations, please. And you do it over and over and over again. So there's another question here. What's the difference between fear and expectations? So there's an interesting line in the big book about fear. It's actually a question. We asked ourselves why we had these fears, and then it answers with a question. Wasn't it because self-reliance failed us? Let me repeat that. We asked ourselves why we had these fears. Wasn't it because self-reliance failed us? So what it's proposing is that something about me, some form of self-reliance, is not working, and the result is I become anxious or fearful or terrorized, whatever the degree is. So it turns out that the link here between fear and expectations is I have some terribly unrealistic expectations about myself, about my ability to be self-reliant. So actually, fear is the result of expectations that I have for myself, that my self-reliance can and should work for me. And by the way, I mean, I do all kinds of stuff that seems to work pretty well. That we're talking about the stuff that's programmed deep within us. Someone has just asked about the downloadable file, so I'm going to post it again here before we're done, so that hopefully it will show up now. And if not, we can figure out how to get it to you through Leslie. Another question here that was sent privately is, so you can make amends within yourself and not to the person you had wronged? Well, if I catch it early enough with my expectations, I don't wrong the other person. If I can catch this before it comes out as action, the remedy is inward directed, not outward directed. If I can let them off the hook inside of me before it gets out of my mouth, I won't do the things that need amending on the outside. It's an amazing thing, and it gets better. We get better and better and better at it. So I've come to think of, if Bill was right, if Bill Wilson was right, that the purpose of the moral inventory, remember this was like 20 years into sobriety. If the purpose of the moral inventory is to find out how we were damaged by life, that changes everything. That means the steps aren't about owning our bad behavior. They're about getting to the root of our bad behavior, which is where the solution needs to come. And in the meantime, we clean up our bad behavior as best we're able. But as we get better and better at it, the solution should be within ourselves, not out there. I just dropped the handout back into the chat box. So hopefully those of you who didn't get it will see it. Got another note in here. Grand sponsor once shared that acceptance is an absolute term, 100% tolerance. Anything less is not acceptance. I think that there is a whole lot of truth. And I love how you close this on the back end. It's the season. Let it go, let it go, let it go. But not making light of that. That letting go may take many, many, many efforts over and over and over again. I think I still have to post this again. I'm not sure if it made it out there. Can others, Leslie, can you see the, I'm going to post the file right now and want to make sure it comes through in the chat box.
I didn't see it again, but I can try on my end.
Can you, there it is. Yeah, it's a Word doc. Can you see it now, Leslie? Somebody just told me they got it. Okay, so everybody, it's there. All right, great. So let me, Leslie, let me wrap this up. Yeah, here's what I think I want to say. I had no idea that these steps were designed to restore me to wholeness, to the state before I ever had restless, irritable, and discontented. That is a remarkable thing for me to be able to say. And I've had that experience. It doesn't always stick around very long. But I can now remember what it was like at the age just about 2 years old, what has happened in my meditation work using the steps. I remember what it was like before I fell from grace, when I was one with the universe and there was no fault to be found anywhere. And my work today is to find my way back to that space just as often as I possibly can, because it is, I mean, to feel healed, as fleeting as it may be, it's just remarkable. So I would really encourage you all to go deep. I hope this has been useful. Take a look at the book if it's useful. Certainly look at this handout I've provided. I see, Leslie, again, a couple of people aren't getting it, so I'm not sure how we solve that. Others are getting it and some aren't. I'm not sure why that is.
I will try to work on it.
Okay, great. So Leslie, I'm going to stop yammering. It's 7:58. That means you can close this appropriately. And if people want to hang out for a little bit afterwards, I'm perfectly fine with hanging out.